So, with the divisional games being finalized and going in order of the games that I think are a little bit easier to predict to the harder ones, starting with the Texans going to Kansas City, I think this is going to be pretty similar to when they played just a few weeks ago. I think the weather is going to be relatively the same. I do think since the Texans were just there, they are going to have a little bit better of a feel for what playing in a much different climate is like, but I still think that this home field advantage here still benefits the Chiefs mostly, since Houston is probably more used to playing in warmer climates, and I do think that it will be a close game similar to before. I do think that it was a little bit misleading in terms of just the score, since Kansas City ultimately got the ball back and probably could have scored at the end and were pretty much in control of the game, especially through the second half. I do think that Houston did look really good against the Chargers, and they definitely are going to come off hot. I think definitely D'Amico Ryans is going to be aggressive, especially from a defensive perspective, but I just think that Kansas City has so much more depth than Houston, and I think that the Chiefs defense has been pretty consistent as well. And then going to the Rams, going to Philadelphia, I do think that this is another even more severe weather advantage or home field advantage for the Eagles. I think the Rams are going to be in a little bit more of a bind to play in a lot more colder weather in Philadelphia, especially if we get a little bit more rain. But I do think that the Rams are looking really good, putting pretty much a dominant win over the Vikings, and just looking at how they've played the second half of the season, I think the Rams are definitely on a roll, but I do think that the Eagles are just a much tougher matchup in general. I think that Saquon Barkley is going to be able to exploit a lot of holes in their defense, and I do think that a lot of their sacks and their big defensive line that's really showed a lot of promise recently is going to have a little bit more trouble with a much more mobile quarterback in Hurts. And I do think that the Eagles have a better secondary and a much better secondary matchup for the good Rams receivers and a lot of their short passes, but I could see this being a close game just since the Rams are playing really well. But I do think that the Rams are a little banged up after the Vikings game. And I think just looking to how the Eagles recently beat the Rams, and that was also in LA earlier in the season, I do think that really pivots the direction of the game to Philadelphia. And then going to the Commanders traveling to Detroit, I was pretty impressed by how Jaden Daniels played against the Buccaneers, but I would say that overall the Commanders did still struggle with Tampa Bay, and with the Lions being a step up from them, I do think that the Lions are going to take this. I do think that the Lions are just a lot more physical and have a lot more explosiveness, especially on their offense, so I think that's going to be hard for Washington to keep up, but I do really like Washington's play style. I like their deep passes. I definitely think that there's going to be a lot of holes in Detroit's pass defense, and I do think that the Commanders are going to be able to make some big plays of their own. But Washington is really going to have to score a lot to keep up with the Lions. I think that Gibbs and St. Brown are just really hard to stop. And I think with the energy of Detroit's dome and how they've just been playing recently, I do think that the Lions should take over and control this game. And then going to the Ravens traveling to Buffalo, just going to the obvious points here, the Ravens did look really strong in their Week 4 matchup against the Bills, and then also looking at what the Bills have done in terms of their recent playoff game, they were able to beat the Ravens 17-3, and that was pretty much a pretty dominant win all the way throughout. So I do think you have a little bit of a trade-off in terms of how this could play out, and I would also say in terms of how the Ravens beat the Bills before at home, really to Buffalo's defense, they did have a pretty significant amount of injuries going into that game. So I do think that this is going to be a much different performance from them, especially from a defensive perspective, but it still is going to be hard to stop Baltimore, whether it's Derrick Henry or Lamar Jackson taking off himself. I think in terms of strategy that the Ravens are again going to try and be really physical and really aggressive on Allen, and I do think that Buffalo is going to do their best to really force the Ravens to pass, but really trying to break this game down even more. I would just say in terms of looking at what the Bills have done recently, I just think that they've really turned it on offensively. If we're looking at their last half of the season, disregarding their last game where they pretty much sat everybody, the Bills scored 30 points or more in 9 of their last 10 games. And I do think that the Ravens are just a little bit more inconsistent this year. And I do think that a real crucial thing is going to be turnovers. I do think I would just slightly have to lean towards Buffalo with how they've played recently and a lot of the gaps in the Ravens defense this year. But feel free to let me know your picks or thoughts for these games, and I'll see you later.